Imagine standing in a forest on Isle Royale, far out in Lake Superior. There are no machines around you, no roads, no modern mine shafts, only trees, rock, and thousands of shallow depressions scattered across the ground. At first, they might look like natural features. They are not. They are the remains of an ancient mining industry, one that existed thousands of years before modern mining transformed the Great Lakes. And what makes the story even more unusual is a 19th century account from the Hopi, recorded roughly 1,500 miles away, describing strangers associated with a great northern body of water and the extraction of metal from the earth. The archaeology is real. The copper is real. The ancient workings are real. But the connection between those things is where the unanswered questions begin. Lake Superior is enormous. It is the largest freshwater lake on Earth by surface area, stretching between Canada and the United States. Along its southern and northern shores lies one of the most unusual natural concentrations of native copper ever discovered. This was not ordinary copper or the metal occurred naturally in a nearly pure form, sometimes as veins, sheets, fragments, and enormous masses embedded directly within the rock. The geological story began more than 1 billion years ago, when the crust in this region experienced massive volcanic activity. A continental rift opened. Lava poured through the fractures repeatedly, creating thick layers of basalt. Later, mineral-rich fluids moved through cracks in those ancient rocks. Over immense periods of time, copper accumulated within them. The result was a landscape containing something extraordinarily valuable to ancient people. Metal that could be physically removed and worked without the complicated smelting processes required for many other copper deposits. Native copper could be hammered, shaped, cut, and heated. That meant people living in the region could work metal without first developing furnaces capable of extracting copper from and eventually they did. When American and European prospectors arrived in the Lake Superior region during the 19th century, they expected to discover a rich mineral frontier. Instead, they discovered evidence that someone had already been there. Ancient pits appeared throughout the copper-bearing areas. Some were shallow, others were substantial. Many followed the geological formations where copper occurred. The pattern was difficult to dismiss as random activity. The ancient miners had repeatedly targeted the richest portions of the landscape. Modern prospectors could sometimes use these old workings as clues to locate copper themselves. The irony was striking. The industrial miners arriving in the 1800s were often following traces left by miners who had disappeared thousands of years earlier. And this was not limited to one isolated site. Across the Lake Superior copper region, ancient workings appeared again and again. Isle Royale became especially important. Thousands of prehistoric mining pits were eventually identified there. The island was not an easy place to reach. It sits within Lake Superior, surrounded by cold and often dangerous water. For ancient people to mine there, they had to travel across the lake, transport supplies and equipment, work during the favorable season, and leave before conditions became dangerous. That required planning. It required knowledge of the lake. And it required a reason important enough to justify the effort. Copper was apparently that reason. The ancient miners did not have steel picks. They did not have explosives. They did not have drills or engines. Their tools were largely made from stone. At ancient mining sites, archaeologists and later investigators found enormous quantities of stone hammers. Many were rounded cobbles. Some were deliberately grooved so that handles could be attached. Others had been fractured or worn down through repeated use. The quantities are remarkable because every broken hammer represents work. The miners had to attack hard volcanic rock using tools that were themselves made of stone. One technique involved fire setting. A fire could be built directly against the rock. After the stone became extremely hot, water could be applied. The sudden temperature change caused the rock to crack. The weakened material could then be broken apart with stone tools. The process could be repeated again and again. Fire, heat, water, stone, human effort. Then the broken rock had to be removed from the excavation. This was slow work, and yet ancient miners continued pushing deeper toward the copper. Among the most remarkable evidence is the discovery of extremely large pieces of native copper. One famous example weighed more than a ton. The ancient miners had already worked around it. They had apparently raised the massive piece using a timber structure so that they could access it. And then they left it. The reason is unknown. Perhaps the copper proved too difficult to transport. Perhaps the mining operation ended. Perhaps circumstances changed. Whatever happened, the enormous mass remained where the ancient workers had abandoned it. For modern observers, the discovery created an obvious question. If ancient miners were willing to invest so much effort in moving a piece of copper weighing more than a ton, how much copper had they successfully removed from the region? That question becomes even more difficult when the scale of the ancient workings is considered. There were thousands of pits. There were enormous quantities of stone tools. And there were extensive areas where the ground had clearly been disturbed by prehistoric mining. The operation had not been small. For many years, the exact age of these workings was uncertain. Ancient forests had grown over abandoned pits. Soil and organic material gradually accumulated. The landscape itself slowly concealed what had happened beneath it. Then archaeological dating methods provided a way to look deeper into the timeline. Charcoal left behind by ancient fires could be dated. Some evidence placed copper mining in the Lake Superior region more than 6,000 years ago. That pushed the beginnings of the industry deep into prehistory. It also meant that copper working in this region was extraordinarily old by global standards. These were not people living in an industrial society. They were using stone tools and fire. Yet they were deliberately locating deposits of native metal and extracting them from solid rock. And the activity did not last for a few generations. Evidence indicates that copper working continued for thousands of years. That is one of the most important facts in the entire story. This was not an isolated experiment. It was a tradition. Knowledge was passed down. Techniques were repeated. Mining locations were revisited. And people continued returning to the same copper-bearing landscape over enormous spans of time. The copper was not simply removed and forgotten. Archaeological discoveries show that Lake Superior copper was shaped into practical and decorative objects. Some examples include points, knives, awls, hooks, bracelets, beads, and other objects. The use of copper appears to have changed over time. Earlier examples include objects with obvious practical purposes. Later, copper increasingly appears in ornamental and ceremonial contexts. Could become a symbol of importance or status. Some copper objects were placed with the dead. This suggests that the material had meaning beyond its usefulness as a raw resource. Copper was becoming part of social life. Perhaps the most important clue to the scale of this ancient industry is geography. Objects made from Lake Superior copper have been found far from the mining region. Copper traveled through networks that connected different parts of ancient North America. Other valuable materials traveled along similar routes. Shells could move hundreds or thousands of miles. Stone from particular geological sources could appear far from its origin. Obsidian, mica, and other materials were exchanged across enormous distances. This means ancient North America was not an isolated collection of disconnected communities. There were networks of movement and exchange. And copper from the Great Lakes became part of those networks. It moved southward into other regions. Some copper objects eventually appeared in areas associated with ancient mound-building societies. The material had traveled across a continent. But then another question appears. If so much copper was extracted, where is all of it? This is where the story becomes more uncertain. The ancient mines clearly produced substantial quantities of copper. But archaeologists have not recovered anything close to all of the metal that must have been removed. Some copper was transformed into tools and ornaments. Some was traded. Some was lost. Some may have been buried. Some may have been recycled into new objects. And some may simply have disappeared through thousands of years of reuse and destruction. Historical estimates of the total amount extracted have varied enormously. Some 19th century observers suggested extraordinarily large quantities. But those calculations were estimates rather than precise measurements. The important point is not a particular number. It is the undeniable mismatch between the enormous scale of the mining landscape and the comparatively small amount of ancient copper objects that survive. That gap has encouraged speculation for generations. One theory proposed that copper may have traveled beyond North America by sea. Others have suggested ancient overseas visitors. But there is no conclusive archaeological evidence proving that foreign seafarers came to Lake Superior and removed its copper. That distinction matters. The ancient mining itself is established. Long-distance trade within North America is established. Claims about transoceanic miners remain speculative. Now we reach the part of the story that has attracted the most attention. In 1894, an account was recorded involving a Hopi elder. The story referred to a great body of water far to the north and to people associated with metal extraction. The description is striking because the Hopi homeland lies roughly 1,500 miles from Lake Superior. The account was not a modern archaeological report. It was an oral tradition recorded by a 19th-century collector. That means it has to be treated carefully. The circumstances under which such accounts were collected matter. During the 19th century, many American writers were intensely interested in theories about lost civilizations, ancient races, and mysterious peoples who supposedly built the great monuments of North America. Some collectors approached indigenous traditions with their own assumptions already in place. Those assumptions could influence what they asked, what they emphasized, and how they recorded what they heard. So the Hopi account cannot simply be treated as a scientific confirmation of an ancient overseas mining expedition. It does not provide that proof. But the account remains interesting because of the way it describes outsiders associated with mining and a distant body of water. The tradition described the miners as people from an earlier time rather than identifying them straightforwardly with the people living in the region when the story was recorded. That detail has sometimes been interpreted as evidence for an unknown foreign population. But there is another possibility. Oral traditions can preserve memories while transforming them over generations. They can describe ancestral groups, neighboring peoples, migrations, exchanges, or events whose original context has changed. Without knowing precisely how the story developed before it was written down, we cannot determine exactly what the account meant. The responsible conclusion is therefore limited. The Hopi tradition is evidence that such a story was recorded. It is not proof that ancient Europeans, Mediterranean sailors, or another overseas civilization mined Lake Superior. Those are separate claims. Remove the theories about lost civilizations. Remove the idea of ancient fleets crossing the Atlantic. Remove every dramatic explanation that cannot be demonstrated. The story remains extraordinary. Thousands of ancient mining pits existed around Lake Superior. Stone hammers were used in enormous numbers. Fire was used to fracture rock. Native copper was extracted from the ground. The mining tradition stretches back thousands of years. Copper objects traveled great distances across North America. And the landscape preserves evidence of an industry that eventually declined and disappeared. That alone is a remarkable chapter of human history. The people responsible were indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region. Their technological achievement should not be assigned to some imaginary lost civilization simply because modern observers find it difficult to comprehend. They understood the geology. They knew where copper could be found. They developed methods for extracting it. They crossed dangerous water to reach deposits. They organized labor. They transported materials. They traded the finished metal over great distances. And they continued the tradition for generations upon generations. This may be the hardest question of all. After thousands of years, the ancient mining landscape eventually became quiet. The pits filled. Forests returned. Soil accumulated. The people who had worked the copper disappeared from the archaeological record as miners, leaving behind only fragments of their industry. We cannot identify one simple event that ended the ancient mining tradition from the evidence presented here. There may have been changes in population, changes in trade, changes in technology, changes in social organization, or changes in the value and availability of copper. The evidence does not provide a single definitive explanation. And that uncertainty is important. History is not always a locked box waiting for one spectacular answer. Sometimes the evidence gives us a remarkably detailed picture of what happened while leaving the reasons behind it unresolved. Today, the forests of Isle Royale conceal much of the ancient mining landscape. But the pits remain. They are physical traces of people who worked this land thousands of years ago. The stone hammers remain as well. So do the copper objects that survived in archaeological sites across the continent. And somewhere beneath the layers of soil, rock, forest, and history are the remnants of countless other objects that were made, traded, buried, recycled, or lost. The copper itself may have traveled farther than we can ever reconstruct. Some of it may have been melted or reshaped repeatedly. Some of it may have ended up in places where archaeologists have not recognized its original source. And some of it may be gone forever. The 1894 Hopi account adds another layer to the story, but it does not solve it. It gives us a historical record of an oral tradition. It does not tell us exactly who the ancient miners were. It does not establish an overseas expedition. And it does not explain the disappearance of the ancient mining industry. What it does is remind us how incomplete our picture of the distant past can be. A story preserved far from the Great Lakes speaks about a distant northern water and people associated with extracting metal. Thousands of miles away, the ground still contains the evidence of an ancient mining tradition. The similarities are intriguing. The connection remains unproven. And that is where the story should end, not with a claim of a lost civilization, but with the evidence we can actually defend. There was an ancient copper industry around Lake Superior. It lasted for thousands of years. Its workers extracted native copper using stone, fire, water, and enormous amounts of human labor. Their metal traveled across North America. Much of it has never been accounted for. And long after the miners disappeared, their pits remained hidden beneath the forest. Perhaps that is the most remarkable part. The people are gone. The tools are mostly broken. The copper has been scattered. But the landscape still preserves the work. Thousands of years later, those old excavations continue to tell us one simple thing. Someone was here. They knew exactly what they were looking for. And they knew how to get it out of the earth.